Scientists found the ship nearly 10,000 feet underwater. The discovery of Endurance, a 144-foot wooden ship that sank in 1915, sending underwater robots deep below the ice, hoping to make polar history.
Finding a specific shipwreck in the Weddell Sea is like finding a single needle in a 1,000 square mile haystack during a blizzard, while the haystack is actively trying to crush you. It's impossible. Yet the Endurance 22 expedition did it. They found Shackleton's lost ship perfectly preserved 10,000 feet down. But the story isn't the discovery, it's what the robots filmed when they got there. The wreck is covered in life forms that shouldn't exist. A terrifying deep-sea colony guarding the greatest maritime legend in history. What the robots saw first. On March 5, 2022, the control room of the South African icebreaker Agulhas 2 was completely silent. This wasn't just any expedition. This was the Endurance 22 mission, a search that many called impossible. They were hunting for a ghost in the worst place on Earth, the Weddell Sea. This body of water is a natural fortress. It's a swirling vortex of ice called a gyre, a place where continent-sized plates of multi-year ice come to grind against each other. It's a ship killer. The crew was on edge. You see, this wasn't the first time they had tried this. An earlier mission in 2019 had ended in total failure. On that try, they had lost their multi-million-dollar autonomous underwater vehicle, or AUV. It was a high-tech marvel, and the ice crushed it like a soda can. The deep ocean simply swallowed it. That machine and its data were never seen again. So, when the Agulhas 2 returned, they knew they weren't just fighting history. They were fighting a place that actively destroys what we send into it. Their new weapon was a pair of state-of-the-art AUVs named Sabertooth. These $35 million yellow torpedoes were the best of the best, built to withstand the crushing pressure and navigate on their own in the total blackness. The search area was a massive 150 square miles, and the target was less than 150 feet long. It was, to put it mildly, a needle-in-a-haystack operation. 2 miles straight down for weeks, the saber-toothed dove scanned and returned. Nothing, just endless gray mud on the sonar. Then it happened. A shape appeared on the sonar feed, a dark mass distinct from the rock and silt of the sea floor. It was the right size. It was in the right place. The entire team held their breath. They retasked the robot. Go back, get closer, turn on the lights. The robot glided through the pitch-black water, its powerful LED lights cutting into a darkness that had been absolute for over a century. And there it was, the wreck of the Endurance. The first thing the explorers felt wasn't joy, it was shock, and maybe a little bit of fear. The ship was in a state of preservation that borders on the supernatural. It was sitting upright, proud, and defiant on the sea floor, almost like it was parked. The name Endurance was still clearly visible on the stern, spelled out in bold, ghostly gold letters. The ship's wheel was intact. The ship's bell was there. The mast had snapped and lay across the deck, but the hull itself looked like it could sail tomorrow. This perfect preservation is the first terrifying thing. You see, the wreck lies at 10,000 feet. At that depth, the pressure is over 6,000 pounds per square inch. That's like having a full-size pickup truck pressing down on every single square inch of your body. This environment is so extreme it's hostile to almost all known life. There is zero sunlight. The water temperature is just above freezing at about 31 degrees Fahrenheit. What many overlooked is that these same terrifying conditions are what protected the ship. The crushing dark is so cold and oxygen poor that the microorganisms that normally eat wood simply cannot survive. There are no wood-boring worms, no shipworms that plague wrecks like the Titanic. The Endurance hasn't rotted or decayed. It is in effect flash frozen in time. But the explorers' shock quickly turned to something else, a deep, unsettling awe. Because as the robot's cameras panned across the deck, they saw it. The ship wasn't alone. It was covered in life, not the kind of life you'd expect. These weren't fish. These were creatures straight out of a science fiction horror movie. Long, pale, stalk-like things waved gently in the current created by the robot. Ghostly white anemones, like flowers from another world, were clustered on the railings. Sea squirts, sponges, and strange feathery organisms called crinoids clung to every surface. You could see a stack of plates in the pantry, and a pale, unblinking creature was living on them. The ship wasn't a wreck. It had become an ark, a vertical oasis in the middle of a barren, muddy desert. The terrifying part wasn't that the ship was a grave, it was that it had become a nursery for things that looked completely alien. These creatures, unblinking and silent, seemed to be guarding the ship. They had claimed it. Minson Bound, the expedition's director of exploration, said it best. He called it the finest wooden shipwreck he had ever seen, by far. The footage is chilling. You can see boots left by the crew, the broken skylight, and the ship's rigging. It's a perfect time capsule from 1915. But this is where the wild theories begin. The official scientific explanation for this life is something called a ship wake effect. The ship's hull, sitting in a weak current, speeds up the flow of water, delivering more food to these filter feeders. It makes sense. But the Endurance crew whispered about other things. There's a story from the control room. An operator piloting the drone around the stern reported something that didn't make the news. Just beyond the range of the robot's powerful lights, in the hard black, the operator saw a shape. A large shape, dark and indistinct, shifting in the shadows. It wasn't mud, it wasn't rock. The operator claimed it looked alive and that it seemed to be watching the robot. The moment they tried to move the camera to get a better look, the shape was gone, vanishing back into the impenetrable dark. What was it? Scientists on board dismissed it, a trick of the light, a shadow from the AUV. But the operator was shaken. The Antarctic is home to colossal squid, creatures up to 45 feet long with eyes the size of dinner plates. It's home to sleeper sharks that can live for 500 years. Or was it something else? Some theorists are now asking, what if those alien creatures on the hull aren't just an accident? What if the Endurance is now bait in a giant natural trap? What if those ghostly anemones are just the lure for a much larger, unseen predator? What if the ship is not a monument but is now a decoration? This ghostly perfect wreck, colonized by strange creatures and watched by shadows, is just the final chapter. The real story, the real terror, isn't what the robots found. It's what Shackleton and his 27 men endured to get away from it. They were now 24 men stranded on a floating piece of ice, hundreds of miles from anything. The ship that wouldn't surrender. To understand the terror of the Endurance, you have to go back to 1914. This was the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. It was a whole different ballgame back then. It was a time when men were driven by a burning desire to be the first, to conquer the last unknown spots on the map. The South Pole had just been reached. The new biggest prize was the first land crossing of the Antarctic continent. Sir Ernest Shackleton, a charismatic iron-willed Anglo-Irish explorer, was obsessed with this prize. He was a been-there, done-that kind of guy for polar travel. He had already been to the Antarctic twice, coming within 97 miles of the South Pole before having to turn back. He was a national hero, but he wanted more. He had a new, incredibly ambitious plan. The Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition. The plan was bold, to put it mildly. He would sail his ship, the Endurance, into the Weddell Sea on one side of the continent. He and a small team would then get off and walk 1,800 miles clear across the continent, passing over the South Pole to the Ross Sea on the other side, where another ship, the Aurora, would be waiting. It was a pincer movement against an entire continent. It was brilliant. It was also, some said, mad. It was a massive gamble. And the Weddell Sea was the worst place to start. It was, and still is, a churning cauldron of ice. Whalers called it the ice's home. It's where old, thick, multi-year ice flows go to spin in a massive, slow-moving vortex. It's a place that doesn't let go of what it catches. This is where the first wild theory comes from. Shackleton wasn't naive. He was a veteran. The whalers at South Georgia, the last stop before the ice, warned him. They told him the ice was unusually heavy that year. They said the sea was closed. These were men who knew the ice better than anyone, and they told him to wait a year. But Shackleton was on a timeline. He had sponsors, a crew, and a rival team to beat. Out of hubris, he ignored the warnings. He famously told them, "We're going." He believed in his ship. And to be fair, the Endurance was a marvel. It was a 144-foot, three-masted barkentine built in Norway, specially designed for polar ice. This thing was a beast. Its wooden hull was, in some places, over 4 feet thick. It was made of oak and Norwegian fir, some of the strongest and most flexible woods in the world. It was designed so that when the ice closed in, the ship's curved hull would cause it to pop up and rest on top of the ice like a cork. It was, they thought, invincible. But not all things are what they seem. The Endurance never even made it to the continent. In January of 1915, just 2 days' sail from their landing spot, the ice closed in. But this wasn't loose, broken ice. It was thick, heavy pack ice, cemented together by a sudden, brutal, cold snap. The Endurance didn't pop up. The ice didn't break. It was caught, as Shackleton wrote, like an almond in a bar of chocolate. At first, the men weren't worried. They were explorers. This was part of the adventure. They were stuck, but they were safe, warm, and had plenty of food. Shackleton ordered the daily routines to continue. They played hockey on the ice. They raced the sled dogs. The ship's photographer, Frank Hurley, took stunning, ghostly pictures of the ship trapped in the ice, a tiny speck of human invention in a vast, white wilderness. But the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. The ship and the ice floe it was trapped in began to drift, not toward land, but north, away from their goal. They were being carried by the Weddell Sea gyre, the very vortex the whalers had warned them about. Then, in April, the sun set for the last time. The 4-month-long Antarctic polar night began. Now the terror was real. The men were trapped in total darkness 24 hours a day in temperatures that plunged to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The Endurance was their only refuge, a single speck of warmth and light in a dead, frozen world. They were completely alone. The real enemy wasn't the cold, it was the ice. The pack ice is not a solid sheet, it's a living, moving monster made of continent-sized plates of ice, all grinding against each other with unimaginable slow-motion force. The men started to hear the ice barking, a sound like distant gunfire. Soon, that sound got closer. The ice was starting to squeeze the ship. The thing nobody tells you is that the Endurance did not sink quickly. It was tortured for weeks. On October 24, 1915, after 9 long, dark months of being trapped, the real pressure hit. A massive ice floe, a growler, slammed into the ship's side. The men described the sound as a series of heavy, muffled reports. The ship's wooden beams, each one thicker than a man's body, began to snap. One man described the sound as like the breaking of a giant's bones. The ship began to groan, a high-pitched, wailing sound that the men said sounded like a living thing in agony. The pressure buckled the hull. Ice-cold seawater began to pour into the engine room. The men worked the pumps for days, a hopeless task. The ship was dying. Shackleton, seeing his dream and his vessel destroyed, gave the order, "She's going down, boys." It's time to get off. They scrambled onto the ice, saving only the bare essentials, the lifeboats, food, and Frank Hurley's precious photographic plates. They had to leave almost everything else behind. For 3 more weeks, they camped on the ice next to their dying ship. They watched, horrified, as the ice, moving with the force of a glacier, slowly, methodically crushed the Endurance. The stern was lifted 30 feet in the air before the ice snapped its spine. On November 21st, 1915, the ship finally gave up. With a final sickening lurch, the Endurance slipped beneath the ice and vanished. The men were silent. They were now 28 men stranded on a floating piece of ice, hundreds of miles from land in the middle of the most hostile sea on Earth. Their ship was gone and a new, more terrible journey was about to begin. Escape from a frozen prison. The sinking of the Endurance was not the end of the terror. It was the beginning. Shackleton and his 27 men were now in the worst place on Earth. They had no ship, no radio, and no hope of rescue. No one in the world even knew where they were. Their expedition was not due to be heard from for at least another year. They were, in every sense, totally on their own. Their new home was the ice floe itself. They called it Patience Camp. But patience was a luxury they couldn't afford. The ice they were on was not stable ground. It was a moving, cracking, and melting raft. The psychological pressure was immense. They were adrift. One night, a massive crack in the ice split their camp in two right between the tents. Shackleton himself nearly fell into the freezing water. A man in his sleeping bag on a piece of ice that broke away had to be rescued in the dark. The men were in a constant state of high alert, listening to the grinding and groaning of the ice around them, praying it wouldn't open up beneath their sleeping bags. Food was their biggest problem. They had salvaged some supplies, but it wasn't enough. They hunted the few seals and penguins that appeared. To conserve their precious human food, Shackleton had to make a heartbreaking decision. The sled dogs, which they had brought for the continental crossing, were consuming too much. They had to be put down. It was a grim, necessary act that crushed the men's morale. These were their pets, their companions. For 5 more months, they drifted on the ice, slowly starving. By April 1916, their ice floe had drifted north into warmer waters. It began to break up. The solid ground beneath their feet was turning into a slushy, dangerous mess. The floe that was once miles wide was now just a small, fragile piece. The moment came. The ice broke apart for good. Shackleton yelled the order, "Launch the boats!" They had salvaged the ship's 3 lifeboats, the James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills. These were small, open wooden boats never meant for the open ocean. Now they were the men's only hope. 28 men crammed themselves and their few remaining supplies into these tiny boats and set off into the icy, storm-tossed Southern Ocean. The voyage that followed was a 7-day nightmare. This is the terrifying part that many people overlook. They were hit by a relentless gale. Waves as tall as buildings crashed over them. The air was so cold that the ocean spray froze the moment it hit the boats and the men. Their clothes became solid armor of ice. The boats became coated in hundreds of pounds of ice, making them top-heavy and threatening to capsize and sink at any moment. The men, already weak from hunger, had to constantly chip away at the ice with axes and knives just to stay afloat. They were soaked, frozen, and suffering from severe frostbite. Their hands were raw. They were surrounded by water, but they couldn't drink any of it. Their fresh water was stored in casks that had frozen solid. They were literally dying of thirst while floating in an ocean. After 7 days of this freezing cold hell, they spotted land. It was Elephant Island, a desolate, jagged rock island 130 miles from anything. It was the first solid ground they had stood on in 497 days. But it was not a rescue, it was just a slightly more stable prison. Elephant Island is a frozen, wind-blasted rock. No ships ever passed it. No one would ever look for them there. Shackleton knew it. They were safe from drowning, but they would now perish from starvation and exposure. He knew he had one last desperate gamble to play. He would take the strongest of the lifeboats, the 22-foot James Caird, and try to sail it across the most dangerous stretch of water on the planet, the Southern Ocean. His target was the whaling station on South Georgia Island. It was 800 miles away. This plan was, to put it mildly, completely insane. It was like trying to cross the Atlantic in a rowboat during a hurricane in winter. Shackleton chose 5 men to go with him, including the brilliant navigator Frank Worsley. The ship's carpenter, Harry McNish, reinforced the small boat, building a makeshift deck out of canvas and sledge runners. On April 24, 1916, Shackleton and his 5 men set sail, leaving the other 22 men behind on the beach. The voyage of the James Caird is arguably the single greatest feat of survival and navigation in human history. For 16 days, the 6 men were tossed around in their tiny boat. They were constantly wet, constantly bailing freezing water. They had to fight off frostbite. And then the wave hit. Shackleton, who was at the tiller, saw what he thought was a strange white-topped cloud on the horizon. He wrote later that he told the men the sky was clearing, but then he realized what he was looking at. It wasn't a cloud. It was the crest of a single monstrous rogue wave, a wall of water easily 60 to 100 feet high. It was a gray-bearded monster. They had no time to do anything but hold on. The wave broke over them, filling the boat with water. For a terrifying minute, they were sure they were sinking, but somehow the little boat popped back up, half submerged but afloat. Against all odds, after 16 days, they spotted the black cliffs of South Georgia. They had made it. But the island had one last test. They landed on the wrong side. The whaling stations were on the other side, 26 miles away, across an uncharted, glacier-filled, and completely impassable mountain range. Shackleton, Worsley, and one other man, Tom Crean, took their last bit of food, put screws through their boots for grip, and started walking. For 36 hours straight, with no sleep and no climbing gear, they crossed the frozen mountains and glaciers that no human had ever crossed before. This is where the story gets really strange. It's the most famous wild theory of the whole saga because it came from Shackleton himself. Years later, he, Worsley, and Crean all swore to the same thing. They all independently felt that there was a fourth person walking with them on that march. A silent, unseen companion. They all felt a presence that was guiding them, giving them strength, and keeping them going. Shackleton wrote, "I know that during that long and racking march of 36 hours, it seemed to me often that we were four, not three." What was it, a shared hallucination brought on by exhaustion and starvation? A guardian angel? Or was it something else? Something from the ice? A spirit of the Antarctic that had been with them since the Endurance first got trapped? Some theorists have connected this presence to the one the whalers feared, the one that makes the ice bark. When the three men finally staggered into the Stromness whaling station, covered in soot and frost, the grizzled Norwegian whalers who found them were so shocked they couldn't speak. They looked, as the station manager later said, like madmen. He had saved himself, but could he save the 22 men left freezing on that rock? The creatures guarding the wreck. Shackleton's story, of course, ends in triumph. After crossing South Georgia, he immediately began planning a rescue. It took him 3 agonizing months and 4 different attempts, fighting sea ice and storms, but on August 30th, 1916, he finally returned to Elephant Island. He found all 22 of the men he had left behind. They were alive. Not a single man from the Endurance crew was lost. It's a story of leadership and human endurance that has become a legend. But the ship itself, the Endurance, remained lost, a ghost. Its exact location was one of the last great mysteries of this heroic age. Until March 2022. The hunt for the Endurance was, in many ways, just as challenging as Shackleton's own journey. The Agulhas II was the most advanced polar research vessel on Earth, and it was pushed to its absolute limits. The thing nobody tells you is that the 2022 expedition wasn't the first try. A previous mission had failed. In that attempt, an advanced AUV was lost to the ice and the crushing pressure. It was never seen again. A multi-million-dollar piece of technology just gone. So when the Endurance 22 expedition set out, they knew the stakes. They were fighting the same ice, the same freezing temperatures, and the same terrifying depths. But this time, they found it. And the footage the robot sent back reveals the true terrifying nature of the deep Antarctic. First, let's talk about the creatures, those alien-like stalked organisms and ghostly anemones. Deep-sea biologists were baffled. Why? Because the Endurance is made of wood and the creatures are filter feeders. This means they are catching tiny particles of food floating by in the water. But scientists thought this part of the Weddell Sea was a food desert, with almost no nutrients and a very weak current. The wreck of the Endurance proves this theory wrong. The ship itself, standing proud on the seafloor, has created its own ecosystem. It's acting like a giant 144-foot-long paddle, forcing a weak current to speed up as it flows around and over the hull. This accelerated current, called the ship-wake effect, is just strong enough to deliver a constant fast food conveyor belt of nutrients to the creatures clinging to it. The ship isn't just a wreck, it's a living reef, a vertical island of life in an endless, muddy void. The creatures living on it are perfectly adapted to the crushing dark. They are terrifying to us because they represent a form of life that needs no sun, no warmth, and can survive pressure that would turn a human into jelly. They are the true masters of that environment. But that's not the only thing the robots saw. There's another, more unsettling detail. One of the operators on the Agulhas II reported something that has become part of the expedition's lore. While piloting the drone around the wreck, deep in the shadows just beyond the ring of the robot's powerful lights, they saw something. A large, dark shape shifting in the blackness. The operator claimed it looked alive and that it seemed to be watching the robot. The moment they tried to move the camera to get a better look, the shape was gone, vanishing back into the impenetrable dark. What was it? Scientists on board were quick to dismiss it. A trick of the light, a shadow from the AUV itself, a piece of snot or marine snow drifting in the current. But the operators weren't so sure. What could it be? The Antarctic seas are home to the colossal squid, a creature that can grow up to 45 feet long and has eyes the size of dinner plates. They are known to live at these depths. Or maybe a Greenland shark, also known as a sleeper shark, a creature that can live for 500 years and grows to over 20 feet long, moving slowly and silently in the dark. We will never know. But the report itself is terrifying. It's a reminder that at 10,000 feet down, we are the aliens. We are the intruders, and we are not alone. The Endurance sits in a place we can visit, but we can never ever understand. This is the ultimate terrifying truth the robots revealed. The Endurance shipwreck is not a dead, forgotten thing. It is a monument, yes, but it is also an oasis, a fortress, and a mystery. The search for Shackleton's ship is over, but the search for what is living on it and around it has only just begun. People watching this are often looking for a deep mystery. Are we missing a key detail? Is it possible all this happened just by chance? The thing is, the Endurance teaches us two lessons. The first from Shackleton is that the human spirit is almost impossible to break. The second from the wreck itself is that nature and the deep ocean are forces far more powerful, strange, and terrifying than we can ever imagine. The wreck is perfectly preserved, but what about the shadowy figure the robot saw? Is the Endurance guarding one more secret? Let us know. And don't forget to like and subscribe.